now we are going to Dustin J. Byrd.
He will tell you the truth now.
That's great.
Right.
Okay, Dustin, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah. Hello, brother.
Excellent.
Welcome
Excellent.
to have
Thank you. Здравствуйте, товарищ. Okay, so I have a paper here that I've been working on, and it's called Between Ethno-nationalism and Pathological Critique, Critical Theory as Critique and Defense of the Western Tradition. And so I have the first so many pages here. I'll try to read through them and try to hit some of the major ideas, and hopefully I'll get through the main chunk of it. I've got two computers here, so if I'm not looking at you, though.
No problem.
So, okay, so critical theory is in a precarious state at the moment. It finds itself caught between two destructive social forces that are currently metastasizing, at least within American civil society and to a certain extent within Western civil societies in general. First, the growing lure of ethno-nationalism, which seeks to right the perceived wrongs of cultural liberalism, multiculturalism, globalization. And on the other hand, the growing entrenchment of what I call pathological critique, which seeks to aggressively exorcise the wrongs of the hypocritical Enlightenment, which failed to realize its promises of liberté, égalité, and fraternité. Recently exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and the 4-year presidency of the aspirational fascist Donald Trump, these two destructive forces have created mass psychoses in American civil society that appear to be self-perpetuating, self-sustaining, and ultimately self-destructive. Critical theory, which often stands accused by the European and American political right of being the initiator of this frenzied condition, in reality stands critically between ethno-nationalism and pathological critique. It's the purpose of this short essay to locate critical theory between the two and demonstrate why it must remain recalcitrant to them both. So America's inability to realize the full universality of its stated Enlightenment creed is no secret. Systematic racism, exploitative capitalist class antagonisms, gender inequality, and explicit attempts to marginalize the non-identical have all been well documented. Eruptions of racist violence against ethnic minorities is as frequent in America as the pogroms against the Jews were in medieval Europe. However, with the increasing racial, cultural, and religious diversification of the American citizenry, in other words, the expansion of the willed community, the Willensgemeinschaft, beyond the various European ethnoi, this diversification has strained the concept of e pluribus unum, from the many to the one, beyond conceivability for many. The modern concept of the democratic citizen, rooted in constitutional political foundations as opposed to ethnic foundations, challenges the sense of identity of those who cling to pre-political ethnic foundations as being the basis of the organic people's community, the Volksgemeinschaft. It has been fashionable among many in the far right to claim that America is not a nation of people, as nations are only formed on the basis of ethnicity, shared language, shared history, shared religion, and/or cultural traditions. Civil citizenship, a willed nation of people bearing ascribed membership within a community, cannot last, according to the right, for politics and political ideals lack the material adhesives that ethnoi provide. It is a false kingship, one that may have had hope when constituted within similar ethnic groups, but impossible, or false kinship, but impossible to maintain within a country that embraces the full diversity of humanity. Due to this perceived collapse in the American identity brought on by over-diversification, or what in Germany is now being called Überfremdung, the Oberforeignization, a retreat into ethno-nationalism has been called for. Reconnecting Blut to Boden within the historical European ethnosphere seeks to overcome what the right perceives as a collapse of the distinctiveness of Western society, the loss of its distinct identity. In order to reestablish this lost identity, many frustrated and aggrieved Europeans and Euro-Americans have joined far-right ethno-nationalist groups, asserting not their genocidal hatred for the other, but rather their hatred for the other's simple presence within their ethnosphere. These far-right groups claim that they seek to preserve the diversity of humanity, including European diversity, through the de-diversification of European ethnospheres. In other words, the right to differ, which all people have, demands the establishment of ethnostates in Europe and North America, as well as throughout the rest of the world. The ghettoization of national cultures is the only way to protect the diversity of the human population, it is argued. Nevertheless, to achieve such a goal, one must practice the old Spartan tradition of xenolasia, the periodic and forcible removal of all anatopis, people in the wrong place, from the ethnosphere, which, according to the far right, must begin in the West. Those belonging to non-European ethnicities, those bearing religions other than Christianity, the foreign-born who immigrate to the West, must remigrate to their ancestral lands, as their continual exile from their lands of origins contributes both to the de-diversification of humanity and to the hatred diversification of the European and Euro-American ethnosphere. This global project, which seeks to restore a civilizational balance between nations, instills a renewed sense of identity among Westerners who have long felt bewildered by the rapid changes of the West, who have witnessed the collapse in ethnic identity, and who have sensed that their lands and nations no longer belong to them. Nevertheless, upon this purifying ideology, critical theory casts a skeptical eye, for the echoes of the last outburst of nationalist purifying fever led to the murder of millions. On the other side of this debate, so on the other hand of the political spectrum, we find a growing tendency to engage in what I call pathological critique by many within the broader spectrum on the political left. Of course, as a critical theorist, I recognize the irony of describing another form of critique as being pathological, which denotes irrationality, sickness, and neuroses, but I think my claim is defensible. I argue that there is a distinguishable element between the rational determinate negation, Aufheben, that is inherent within critical theory's critique of the given, and the irrational abstract negation that has become pathological within certain fashionable sectors of the left today. In determinate negation, the material from the past that is intellectually and morally salvageable and consequently translatable into a modern idiom ought to be rescued, fulfilled, and advanced. That which belongs to the dustbin of history ought to be relegated to the dustbin of history through the process of rational critique. Irrational critique, on the other hand, is what we're now beginning to see more and more. What I'm calling pathological critique is born out of the same failure to realize the full potential of the Enlightenment, particularly its promises of liberté, égalité, and fraternité. Those who engage in pathological critique see in the West only through the prism of that which ought to be negated, most often due to the long history of racism, gender domination, worker exploitation, slavery, and the tendency for religious institutions to justify, legitimate, and sanctify the unjust status quo of the slave societies, the feudal system, and now the neoliberal capitalism. Because the history is long defined by the West's relations with other peoples, most often with darker complexions, the West's history takes on a biological component. It is the history of quote unquote white people, and to be white is to be an incarnate representative of various systems of oppression. The pathology of this form of critique, that which makes it a sickness, is that it fails to distinguish between that which is salvageable within the Western tradition, Western civilization, and that which ought to be negated. With total whitenization, a process by which all aspects of the Western tradition takes on the sins of the most deleterious part of the Western history, an abstract negation, a total negation, according to Hegel's logic, is called for as a means of cleansing the West of its whiteness. For example, numerous American universities have recently announced they will exclude various classics from Western literature from their curriculum, arguing that such classics have prepared the way for white supremacy, colonization, and continual psychological slavery of non-whites. The historian of ancient Rome, Dr. Daniel Padilla Peralta, who teaches at Princeton, is fully prepared to sacrifice his own discipline of classical studies to save it from its assumed whiteness. Far from being extrinsic to the study of Greco-Roman antiquity, he writes, the production of whiteness turns on the close examination to reside in the very marrow of the classics. Padilla Peralta is not alone. Faculty at some of the most prestigious universities in America have championed the idea that in order for the West to truly become anti-racist, the study of ancient Greco-Roman history and society must die, quote, as swiftly as possible, unquote. The great Western classics should not be studied alongside Egyptian, Babylonian, Persian history, language, and religion, but ought to be negated entirely as a field of study, as it bears the inexorable sin of white supremacy. In April of 2021, just this month, the philosopher Cornel West argued in a Washington Post op-ed that Howard University's recent dissolution of its classics department was a spiritual catastrophe. That one that demonstrated that, quote, we as a culture have embraced from the youngest age utilitarian schooling at the expense of soul-forming education. West goes on to say that academia's continual campaign to disregard or neglect the classics is a sign of spiritual decay, moral decline, and a deep intellectual narrowness running amok in American culture. Those who commit this terrible act treat Western civilization as either irrelevant and not worthy of prioritization, or as a harmful and worthy only of condemnation, unquote. That's from Dr. Cornel West. Anti-racism and anti-colonialism, as well as anti-gender inequality, when pathologized, calls for the abstract negation not only of the classics, but also some of the most influential of modern philosophers, including Immanuel Kant and Georg Hegel, for they both have made remarks deemed racist and or sexist by 21st century readers. One cannot even begin to fathom how to remove Kant's influence from philosophical subdisciplines such as ethics, epistemology, political philosophy, and philosophy of religion. The same goes for Hegel, whose work in those fields has influenced philosophy immeasurably. Not only has philosophy post-Kant and post-Hegel been mere commentary on their work, but their own predecessors have been reevaluated based on the work of Kant and Hegel. Yet, from the standpoint of pathological critique, even Hegel's dialectical logic, which is formal by and large, is tainted with white racism and therefore worthy of dismissal. Karl Marx, too, for the most extreme of the pathological critics, has come under the gun for his seemingly anti-Semitic remarks in his 1844 Zur Jugendfrage, on the Jewish question. Freud, too, must be canceled, but they've been trying to cancel him for a long time. Although admittedly not far from perfect, it seemed especially demeaning to women, and must now, over 100 years after the birth of psychoanalysis, be canceled, banished to the dung heap of historical bad ideas. Nevertheless, removing philosophers like Kant, Hegel, Marx, and Freud from the Western pantheon due to perceived philosophical sins would leave a cavernous hole in Western philosophy, one that cannot be easily fulfilled by philosophical ethnomasochism. Recently, I read a claim by a fellow academic who offhandedly stated that the scientific method itself was a white invention and thus tainted with racism, and thus should be rejected by the non-white world. While it is true that the scientific method has been utilized and or abused to justify any number of racist ideologies and fascistic pseudoscience endeavors, the method itself does not belong to white society, as the method was used outside of the Western world long before Copernicus and Galileo. The call for the abstract negation of modern science, Western philosophy, Western classics, and other forms of thought that were cultivated within the historical Western ethnosphere continues unabated. Those on the left who have articulated their disagreement with such a wholesale critique of the Western society have been drowned out and or accused of secretly fostering sympathies for white nationalism and white supremacy. Just as the white nationalist yearns for racial and ethnic purity within the Western ethnosphere, many of those practicing pathological criticism yearn for an intellectual purity, a Spartan Zenalasia, all that they deemed incurably white. Where does critical theory stand in regard to the struggle between nationalism and pathological critique. It appears to me that critical theory, at least that which stems from the first and second generation of the Frankfurt School, is situated between the two and must continue to be situated between the two. Critical theory shares with the right, especially the new right, its critique of capitalism, the meaninglessness and shallowness of the culture industry, as well as concern that the needs and imperatives of the market trump the needs of the masses. Right? This is a very common perspective when reading the new right. However, critical theory cannot accept the biologized nationalism that animates the far right. Neither can it accept the demonization of the others, refugees, anatopists, and those who appear non-identical to the ideal type of the white Westerner. Such politics is anathema to critical theory. On the other hand, critical theory shares with other forms of leftist thought the desire to dismantle forms of oppression, whether it is racism, class domination, gender inequality, capitalist exploitation of labor, and all forms of fascism. Nevertheless, critical theory, rooted well within the Western philosophical, theological, and sociological traditions, cannot engage in the irrationality of pathological critique, wherein their own philosophical foundations are undermined wholesale in the quest for intellectual purity. The very philosophical and secularized theological assumptions that guide critical theory itself are subject to cancellation via pathological critique, a move that, if successful, would make critical theory itself toothless, for it would be drained of its own intellectual resources. From the standpoint of history, the Frankfurt School has always been rooted in Hegel's logic of determinate negation, as Dr. Siebert said, which they applied to the work of Feuerbach, Kant, Marx, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Freud, and other 19th century predecessors. This dialectical logic allowed them to rescue certain semantic, semiotic materials from the intellectual tradition that came before them, while simultaneously allowing that which proved to be false to be left behind as a mere relic of history. Because this dialectical process was not well understood by their intellectual enemies, conservatives, including the conservative philosopher Roger Scruton, who recently passed away, accused the Frankfurt School of being wholly negative. They themselves were viewed as the irrational dismantlers of Western civilization, offering nothing but a negative in the place of what was dismantled. It is true that the Frankfurt School offered no blueprint for what should surpass industrialist capitalist society. No image of a future utopia was furnished. They did not want to create a utopian system that would later be imposed upon future generations as a new system of domination. Nevertheless, Scruton and others were wrong. The Frankfurt School's determinate negation was not entirely negative. The positive, if the positive was to be discovered, to have negative dialectics, was discovered within the negation of the negative. Only rarely were the negative dialectics insisted upon. Yet, this leads us to a problem. It is often unclear what exactly is preserved within critical theory, thus making critical theory appear to be precisely what it cannot be, pathological critique. In reality, critical theory remains and must remain rooted in Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Meister Eckhart, Kant, Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, and many others within the Western pantheon, despite the pantheon's ethical flaws and philosophical presuppositions that cannot be accepted today. Constitutionally, critical theory does not close itself up fundamentalistically. It has always been open to learn from others, while guarding closely its own philosophical foundations. It is my thought that critical theory if it's to remain relevant in the 21st century, it must rescue the Western tradition from both the white nationalists who wish to use it as a weapon against the non-identical, as well as rescue it from the irrationality of pathological critique, who wish to cancel the Western traditions due to its historical flaws. When the broader left abandons the Western intellectual pantheon in pursuit of ideological purity, it delivers a powerful weapon to those who will wield it as a weapon against the left itself, as well as those who the left attempts to champion, to marginalize others and the wretched non-identicals.
Thank you, Dustin.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much for your presentation.